Happy Holy Day.
Happy Holy Day.
It's a magnificent day, and I have a sermon for you. It's called, We Are Called the Hebrews. What does this term mean, Hebrews? We hear it all the time. There's a language called the Hebrew language. Well, with much study and wearing the kingdom goggles, perhaps you'll never look at this word the same again when this sermon has ended. And let's start all the way back in Genesis 12. Now, Genesis 12, God speaks to Abram. And what does he say in verse 1? And the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country. Leave your family, is what he's saying, and from your kindred, and from your father's house, into a land, that's the promised land, that I will show you. Isn't he saying that to us? Exactly like that. Verse 2, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. That's Abraham. I wanted to read that because the first time Hebrew is mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned in Genesis 14. So let's go a couple chapters over, and I'm going to read who it applies to in verse 12 and 13. Genesis 14. Now you have to understand here, his nephew Lot lived in Sodom. And in verse 1 of this chapter, there were kings that went into Sodom and won a victory. Won a victory, that's funny. Then we'll pick it up what happens, and let's start in verse 12. And they took Lot, these kings, and Abram's brother's son, who lived in Sodom, and all his goods, and went away. And there came one who had escaped, and he told Abram the Hebrew. There it is, the first time it's mentioned. For he lived in the plains, and it says where he lived at that time. And he was a Syrian. He wasn't a Jew, Abram. He had to leave the Ur of the Chaldees. Now the word Hebrew, if you look it up, I'll pronounce it phonetically, every. Now that means one from beyond. And that's the crux of my message. The one from beyond. Now what does that mean? Well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all crossed. They had to all leave their country to go over to the promised land. That's where they're heading. It's where we're all heading. So when you look at this word Hebrew, it's one from beyond. Now some have claimed that it all comes down to one man in the Table of Nations. You know where the Table of Nations are in the Bible? So we go to, that's Genesis 10 and 11. So let's go to Genesis 11. And let's begin in verse 10. Now this chapter is all about, you ever heard of the Tower of Babel? Okay? That happened after the flood. And they wanted to build and reach the heaven. That's a whole other story. But it's here that it gives a genealogy. And this man I'm going to mention lived during the time of the Tower of Babel. Now in verse 9, therefore, it's called Babel. Let's pick it up in verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Now, who's Shem? Shem is one of the sons of Noah. And it's through his lineage that you have Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. You know, going all the way to Christ and so forth. Now, that's physical. Okay? You know what the name Shem means? It means, get ready, name. That's what it means. Okay, now Shem, he lived, and if you keep reading here, he had many daughters and so forth, and then you go all the way down. Let's go to 15. And after the Salah beget Eber. Focus on that word, Eber. Some have translated with an H from the New Testament genealogy of Luke. So Selah lived 3 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And Eber, not the driving company, lived 34 years and begat Peleg. And after he begat Peleg, Eber lived 432 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And I did extensive research on this individual. The reason the churches of God throughout its history has taught that this is the one where Hebrew comes from, it's because of the meaning of his name. Now, his name, when you study it, it means the region beyond. Very close to the one from beyond. See, the word Hebrew is talking about us, the one, an individual in this, Abram. His name means a region beyond. It's a little different, isn't it? Okay, but it also sounds like Hebrew, Eber. They connect all that. But when you look at all the data of the Bible and not outside sources, this is all you get. And who did God call a Hebrew? Called him Abraham. Now, they're claiming that it started with this man. Okay, but I'm going to show you something right now. The reason why we want to call ourselves scripturalists. We get our data from the Bible. And how, if we go outside to other sources, it could be a mixture of good and evil, correct? And I think we got influenced by somebody. You ever heard someone in the Church of God go, well, how did the Jews do it? Well, according to tradition. And they step a little forward. Oh, they even do that. Oh, they did do that? Yeah, some guy made it up. Okay? We want to follow the instructions of God. So, in the 8th century, there was a Jewish prophet. 8th century. And his name was Abu Isa. Now, Abu Isa claimed this. He was the 5th prophet in a line. He was the final one. And guess who comes after him? That's interesting. Number 6 is the Messiah. 6 is the number of man. He claimed this. He was a false prophet. And he believed in many things. And you know what he pushed that became popular? He preached that this man, Eber, lived, and he's correct, during the time of Babel, but he was the only one, because he was a good man, that did not go to that evil building. And he stayed behind. He represented the Jewish race, the one he represents, the one with a pure language, making that pure language secure. The one pure language, the Hebrew language. Okay, and so Eber represented that. That's what he claims. Backfire. Why is it a backfire? Because of this. Let's go with it. Let's say it's true. Eber would not be the father of the Hebrews. The pure language would have been Adam. Because if there was only one language, then the guy before him would have spoke that language all the way to Adam. So then Adam would be a Hebrew. And you read in Exodus, God calls his people Hebrews. He says in Adam all die through the Apostle Paul. That's 1 Corinthians 15. So take that and scratch it out. And let's focus with kingdom goggles what really Hebrew means. And you'll see it's a whole new level. And this should inspire you when it's done. And I'm going to say, if you haven't heard this message before, there's going to be things you don't know. And connections. So, with that said, the writers of the Old Testament, Moses wrote the first 5 books. When you look up all the Hebrew and Hebrews, plural, they're surrounded mostly with foreigners in the room, so to speak, in the environment. And it's usually foreigners saying the word Hebrew. And so you look it up. Let's go to Genesis 39. Genesis 39, this is the story of Joseph. And remember where Joseph stayed? He was bought by a slave owner named Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife had the hots for him, which is not good, wanted him to commit adultery, which Joseph was a righteous man and did not. Now in Genesis 39, after some attempts of this, his wife This is the last attempt to hit on Joseph. Genesis 39:11. This word Hebrew is used here. Now listen closely. And it came to pass on a certain day that he, Joseph, came into the house to do his work. And none of the men of the house were inside. Note that. And she caught him by his robe, saying, lie with me. She wanted to rape him. Because that's exactly what Amnon did, if you remember, to Tamar. Grabbed. That's a bad action. And he left his robe in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his robe in her hand and had fled, she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, that's Joseph, has brought in a Hebrew. I'm sorry, that's probably Potiphar. He brought in a Hebrew. Does she like this Joseph right now? She feels rejected. Called him a Hebrew. This foreigner. This one that doesn't belong here. And remember what it means. This one from beyond. Not one of us. See why she's saying this? As an insult. As to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And then the story goes on, verse 17. And she spoke to him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant. She attaches servant to it. Which you have brought to us came to me to mock me. This nobody. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to Genesis chapter 41. It's only a couple chapters up. Joseph goes into jail. He's a man of God. Why should he go to jail? These things happen to us because we're not from here. And blessed are those that are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is what? The kingdom. Our kingdom, God's kingdom, is home. Remember that. Home. So Joseph knew he was a sojourner. So he was temporarily being held for a great purpose. He had a dream of a cupbearer and a baker. And we know the baker ended up being executed. And then what did Joseph say to the cupbearer? Remember me. He forgot about him. And years go by, and let's pick it up in Genesis 41, verse 8. This is Pharaoh, has a dream. And it came to pass in the morning, and his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my sin this day. Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me under guard in the chief of the executioner's house, me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream one night, he and I. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, a sojourner, one from beyond. Who is this guy? A prisoner revealed the truth. God did it through him. A slave to the chief of the executioners. And then we know the story. This opened the door for Joseph to get in, to be the right-hand man to Pharaoh and save Egypt. My point here is when you look it up, another example of who is this guy? He's somebody not from us, but he can interpret your dream. With the power of God, that is. Okay, so there's another example. Then you go all the way to 1 Samuel 14. Listen to this one. 1 Samuel 14. This is the time of King Saul. Now, King Saul never had a name change, by the way. King Saul, 14, had a son, a righteous son, named Jonathan, who had a great armor bearer. And an armor bearer does what? It protects us. So that's a representative of Matthew 18. We all have a guardian angel. And you could read that there. They're like an armor bearer. And so, representing God's protection. So in 1 Samuel 14, there was a fight against who? Saul fought who? The Philistines. Remember, David had to knock down Goliath. And so we have here This is before David and Goliath event. Jonathan was brave with his armor bearer. And they went up and they took out 20 Philistines. 20. And so they're climbing, they're hiding out and they're climbing up, and the Philistines notice them. These two men, and there's like 20 of them, a garrison there. Now what happened? Listen to what they said about them. And we go to verse 11. And both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, "Behold, the Hebrews come out of the holes where they have hidden themselves." And then you can hear, probably. They came out of the holes. Make a note on that one for later in the sermon. See, these are ones that are not from there. And they did this. The Philistines, you know why they call them Hebrews? When the enemy called them Hebrews, it was, "Get out of here. This is our land." That's what they're saying. It's a mockery. So, even though it's a great blessing to be a Hebrew, so here you have an example of a negative again. Now let's go to the prophet Jonah. Let's go to Jonah chapter 1. You know, Jonah and the great fish. He came there to warn all the fish lovers because they worship Dagon. You know, and you see all those bumper stickers with the fish with Christian in it or a cross or something. They're doing the same thing that the Ninevites did. Okay, so the warning had to go out through Jonah. But what did Jonah do? He ran from God. He fled. That's a better word because he took a ship. Okay, so let's go to Jonah 1. Now Jonah, his name means dove. And in verse 1, we read, "And the word of the Lord came to Jonah." And verse 2, "Arise," he says, "go to Nineveh." This is a command. "That great city, and cry against it. For their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah rose up to flee to Tarshish. Now notice, from the presence of the Lord. So if we're a Hebrew, if we're a one from beyond, and our home is somewhere else, we have to be in the presence of the Lord now. He has to watch us. Jonah was trying to get out of that presence. Understand that is a very bad thing. We do that when we sin and we don't want to do God's will. God's will was him to warn Nineveh. Now listen closely to this. Let's pick it up in verse 7 to 9. "And he said," this is when he's in the boat, he was sleeping and there was a mighty storm. And God had to make that storm. So there were strangers that were hired on the boat. 7, "And they said each one to his fellow, 'Come and let us cast lots, so that we may know has caused this evil to come upon us.' And they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah the dove. Then he said to him, 'Please tell us for what reason this evil has come upon us. What is your business? And where do you come from? Where is your country? And of what people are you?' And he answered and said, 'I am a Hebrew. I'm not from around here.'" That's what he was saying. And it's interesting because a lot of people say Hebrews are Jews. That's true in a physical sense, but it's only 1/12. Because you know what tribe Jonah was from? The tribe of Zebulun. See? He was a called out one, and he most likely will be in the first resurrection. So he was a sojourner, and it says he fears the Lord, the God of heaven, who has made the sea and the dry land. Okay, that's the Old Testament, and there's others. God calls his people Hebrews in Exodus. And now let's go to the New Testament. Now remember the Apostle Paul? He was called Saul, but he had a name change to Paul. And let's go to 2 Corinthians 11. 2 Corinthians 11. Paul used this word a few times. And 2 Corinthians 11, I'm going to read verse 21 to 22. He says, I speak as though we were under reproach for being weak, but in whatever way anyone else is bold, I speak in foolishness. I also am bold. And he does a claim here. He says, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Notice why he separates them. They're not exactly the same. Why would he separate them? One's a sojourner. One is a people. Israelites, if you study the word Israel in the spiritual sense, you go all the way to Revelation 14, that's the bride of Christ. That's us. It says, these are the first fruits. The 144,000, it says, these are the first fruits. Now, that's the word of God. You can believe whatever you want, but I'm going to believe that. And that is Israel, the spiritual Israel. Now, all them, when they're on this earth, are not of this world, are they? They make it to the promised land, correct? Yes. So when they were living on the earth, the 144,000, the first fruits, all of these look up, don't they? And they go, that's home. This is a temporary place, right? So, if a Hebrew means one from beyond, a sojourner, when we get to the kingdom, we will be called Israelites, the bride of Christ, and so forth, but we will no longer be called Hebrews. Our journey ended. Once we're in the kingdom, we're not from here. Yes, you are. You represent the kingdom with a crown now. Do you see? So that's why Paul separated them. There's Hebrews, and then there's Israelites. It's good to understand that. So, read the theme of the Bible. What's the theme of a Christian? Is to do what? To follow Christ. And what did Christ do? He represented the kingdom perfectly. He trailblazed the path. He kept the days, the Sabbath, so we keep it. He kept the holy days, so we keep it. We follow the trailblazer, right? And when he was on this earth, he said in John 17, I am not of this world, and either are you, talking to his apostles. See? So, you follow all the instructions constantly. It says, come out of her. Come out of who? Out of Babylon, out of the world system. The one Satan offered Jesus. Why didn't Jesus bite? You know, Satan had a lure. Big lure, nice one. Why didn't he bite? Because he knew he wasn't of this world. That he was a Hebrew. Do you know this, brethren? That you are called to be a Hebrew. You are a Hebrew. So, do you bite? Why do you even nibble? That's sin. It's time to stop this nonsense. Be focused on the prize. Be focused on Jesus Christ, it says. He's our trailblazer. But see where I'm going with this? Why did the Israelites, being Hebrews, leave Egypt? Come out of Egypt. That's a system that's broken. This world is broken. So really, when you look at the word Hebrew, it's all about a spiritual meaning. And if you think about the spiritual meaning of Hebrew, it really means set apart. Aren't we set apart? We're not of this world. We're set apart. You ever heard of that term, I'll see you on the other side? Yeah. I can see a saint with his last breath to his fellow Christians in the congregation. See you on the other side. And he goes out. I mean, that would be a great last word. It really would be. So that's why when we live in this world today, we don't partake of the things of the world. And, oh, I need this system to be better. And we got to vote for this. And we got to change this with Congress and be all involved. Show me where the apostles were involved with the Senate of Rome and brought up in the sermons what was going on in the daily activity. And they had a lot of it going on. In fact, our system is based in America on the Roman system. but you won't find it. They focused on what? The things above. God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, Isaiah 55. Those thoughts. And you know what one of his thoughts are? God says, you are Hebrews. He says that in Exodus. So we got to understand that we're just passing through. We're passing through. And we're looking up to a place called home, and that's New Jerusalem. See? Isn't it a good thing? You should be delighted to say, I am a Hebrew. Now they have a thing like Hebrew roots. Now, when you study Hebrew roots, are they talking about this message? Of looking up, and when you pass by their talk, are they looking and sparked about the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth? God's thoughts and all that? Or are they tied to physical things? Physical things. And did they make it? No. They didn't make it. The only way you can make it to the promised land is to become spiritual. See? So Hebrew has a bigger meaning than what I was taught until this was opened up. It means one from beyond, a sojourner. So, let's go to the golden nugget of this. Because I heard this first at a Bible study Wednesday from our fellow brother, John Thompson. And I never heard this before. I thought Hebrew means physical and all that stuff. And then I looked it up in the Greek in here, and in the Greek it said one from beyond. And right away I put on my kingdom goggles, and God's Spirit just said this to me. Oh, the book of Hebrews is not written to them. It's written to us. To the ones from beyond. And so let's go to Hebrews. It brings a whole new perspective to a whole new level. And that's what God does. So let's go to Hebrews. And I immediately wrote, we're pilgrims seeking the kingdom. You read the first verse, it says God, that's the Father, who spoke to the fathers at different times in the past. Those are the called out ones. In many ways by the prophets, has spoken to us in these last days by his Son. Remember his Son? What's his name? Jesus Christ. What's one of his names? The Shepherd. And when that voice cries out, his sheep hear the voice of his shepherd. Brethren, we hear Jesus' voice. We are the us. This was written to us. The ones that are being developed to be first fruits. He wasn't talking to a physical land, but to a spiritual family. And God is making a spiritual family. That's why we're here. So let's focus on the spiritual. Now, is it a coincidence you go to Hebrews 11, the biggest faith chapter in the Bible, and it has a list of champions of faith? And if your name's written in here, you made it. You're awaiting the resurrection. You're guaranteed to be in the kingdom if you're here. So, got a couple things to examine in here. Let's go to verse 4. Who's the first one mentioned? By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. He was righteous. Now, when you follow it through, it says that Abel makes it because he's waiting at the last chapter, the last verse. We'll read. Why did I bring you here? You ready for this? Eber, if he's the father of the Hebrews because he preserved the pure language, well, no, and then the pure language guy would be Adam. We talked about that, right? But we know what Hebrews means. It's the called out ones that are sojourning to the kingdom of God to be a bride of Christ, right? So, if that's the case, who's the first Hebrew? Abel. Abel's the first Hebrew. Shouldn't we be talking like this? In the congregation of spirituality? Abel's the first one. Then the next would be Seth, wouldn't it? These are ones, but Abel, we know for sure, made it. So then, let's go all the way to verse 8. By faith, Abraham, being called of God to go out into a place which he would later receive for an inheritance. And you're thinking, oh yeah, physical. Okay, now, Say you're thinking physical. Listen to this. Obeyed and went, not knowing where he was going. By faith he sojourned into the land of promise like a foreigner, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the joint heirs of the same promise. And the Hebrew root people are, it sounds all good, it's physical. But then, verse 10, for he was waiting for the city with the foundations of which God is the architect and builder. Not the one on Google Maps. Not the one we got to wait for the moon and wait to see if it's in Jerusalem. Not that one. Jesus Christ says you will no longer worship in Jerusalem in John 4. Remember her, the Canaanite woman? Says we no longer will, but we'll worship in what? Spirit and truth. That's what we worship in. It's invisible where we're going. Our home is invisible. In Hebrew, seek the invisible. And that's what we're being called to. And it's beautiful. Now, he seek the invisible. So then, let's go down to let's read verse 13. All these, this list of people, died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar. It's hard to see the invisible, but they saw it. And having been persuaded of them, and having embraced them, that's the key, you got to embrace the invisible, and having confessed that they were strangers and sojourners on the earth. So everything else on that earth is not part of the system. It's not the Jerusalem on the earth. It's the Jerusalem above. Do you see that? That's what the Christians look for. That's what Jesus Christ brought. He brought spirituality. So that defines a Hebrew right there, a stranger, a sojourner on earth. And you read all of Hebrews 11 with this in mind. It's a great list. And so let's go to the end. Let's go all the way to 37 through 40. It says, after reading this whole list, they were stoned to death. They were sawed in two. Do you imagine that? Their whole body, and it's not no magician trick. They were brutally interrogated. They got rules how America should interrogate. Not these guys. And slaughtered by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in goatskins, being destitute, oppressed, and ill-treated. Now listen closely and think about Jonathan and that armor bearer. They're heroes of faith, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, living in caves and in holes in the earth. Remember the Philistines said to them? Look, they came out of the holes, these Hebrews. All these are written in the book of Hebrews. Isn't that awesome? The Bible should electrify you. It should make you excited and to think on things above. So, you have 39, but these heroes of great faith, although they had received a good report through faith, did not obtain the promise. You're like, what? Because God had determined in advance to provide something superior for us, so that without us, they would not be made perfect. God's going to raise them all up at the same time. And it's going to be at the last trump. And from when you study the holy days, it sure sounds like the Feast of First Fruits, the day of Pentecost. And that's called the perfect day. And so all these heroes of faith, the question is, are you going to be there? And it's simple. This is like A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's really simple. If you don't want to see the invisible, you don't go. If you like and embrace the physical and you want to see and touch and hold and have it now, then you get now. It's as simple as Matthew 6 when Christ says when you do your alms before people, I mean, when you do them in secret. Because if you don't, you're getting your reward now. And if you're not doing them in secret, you know why? Because you don't see the invisible. You see the physical, and that's why you want to be physical. Do you understand? It's real simple. And we all mess up. We've all done these things. The point is, what can we do today? Right? That's what God is looking for. One that is poor in spirit, that wants more, and that wants to look up. And that's interesting. See how I'm doing this? I got to do that a lot because my nature is to look down. Remember even the publican? And he was better than the Pharisee. Remember that in the parable? Now the publican couldn't even look up. He was so shamed. He couldn't look up. But he was on his way because he was so into physical things before and he had to let them go. Let the physical go. Let it go. And seek the things beyond. What do people see when they see you? What do they see? Do they see a human being? Of course. But what about your actions? What about those? Do they see great works of God? What do they see? So, let's represent God's kingdom and do those things. And I want to end it with one verse. Let's go to 1 Peter 2. And I told this scripture, this sermon, to the subject to Eric. He's in the congregation right now. And driving here, I drove up with him. And it's funny, he just happened to be reading 1 Peter 2. And he goes, hey, is this in your sermon? Because it sounds like it. And I go, yes. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. This is a great subject. 1 Peter 2, 9. And I'm going to read 9 to 12. Peter understood what it was to be a Hebrew. But you are a chosen stock, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You know what that nation's called? Israel. That's the first fruits. A people for a possession of God, that you might proclaim his excellent virtues, who called you out of darkness into a marvelous light. Now, where's the light? Remember in Revelation it says there's no need of a moon or a sun because there's so much light from God. Verse 10, who once were not a people, but now are a people of God, who had not received mercy, but now have received mercy. Beloved, I exhort you as strangers and sojourners, fellow Hebrews, to restrain yourselves from lustly flesh, which war against the soul. If you have a problem with lustly flesh, maybe you're not looking up and you're concentrating on the physical. This is the only way to overcome these things, is to concentrate on the spiritual. Now, let's go to verse 12. Having your way of life honest amongst the Gentiles, so that although they speak against you as evildoers, through having witnessed your good works, see how they can witness your good works? Notice how it doesn't say witness you. Witness your good works. That's action. See? That's important. They may glorify God in the day of the visitation. That's once we're in the kingdom. And once we're in the kingdom, we're no longer Hebrews. We're Israelites. We're there. See? Are we beginning to understand this magnificent term called Hebrews? There's a book written about it. So I encourage you in closing, fellow Hebrews, go and read the book of Hebrews with this in mind now. That this means one from beyond. It's talking to us on a journey. Oh, that verse fits, that verse fits, that verse fits. And it even talks, when you read a lot about Hebrews, it talks about them doing a tabernacle and stuff. This fits. It says that was just a model from what's above. What they carried around over there was a model. It says that. From what was above. Because what really is the real one? The one from above. It was a model. It was temporary. Where is it now? It doesn't matter. It's all going to be burned up. The whole earth, the whole system. So stop being fixated on this physical like the rest of the world, like our old man, our old woman. And start focusing on the promised land. Seriously. Do this when you're by yourself. Look up after a prayer or something, and seriously, and go, home, and smile, and meditate on it. I want to go there and be with who? Our fellow called out ones. So this message should inspire you to think more family, and not the physical family, but the spiritual family. So when you're down or having a bad day, or you see another brother or sister who's down, what do you encourage them with? With the kingdom. With the future. The future. Hey, it says the truth will set you free. And the truth will be in the future. That's all it lasts in the future, is the truth. That's an interesting way of looking at that verse. The truth will set us free. True freedom comes only in God's kingdom. So, I presented to you, brethren, a sermon called We Are Called Hebrews. Let's rejoice in that and seek our home daily.